Hey guys, well, the title of the series we're doing is called Shaking the Box, because this is about gaining something that you don't expect. Have any of y'all, we're in church, sometimes confession's good for the soul. Any of y'all ever saw a gift that you didn't realize? Because so much about the Christmas season, we have expectations. We expect certain things. But all of a sudden you saw something you didn't expect, and you were tempted, and maybe sometimes you did, shake the box. Anybody ever do that end of it? Come on, I told off in first service. I'll tell it again today. When I was a kid, one time I actually didn't just shake the box. I snuck into my parents' bedroom, my father's closet, and I found a present, and I actually opened it. I know my dad didn't buy it. My sister was here at first service. She's probably the one that bought it and wrapped it and all. Thank God, Nobody else found out. I should have probably got coal in my stocking that year, but yeah, I had put it all back together But yeah, sometimes we shake the box because there's something unexpected. Well, come on, I want to really talk about this story because it's one that we can lose inside of tradition. We've heard it before. Sometimes it can you hear it again and go, oh, we're going to talk about Christmas again. But yeah, I want you to know there's something maybe unexpected because God's not the great I was. He is and remains the great I am. And I believe He has something amazing for all of us. Through the course of this series, we're going to shake the box because maybe something you didn't expect is going to come alive to you. So that's where we're heading in this series. So guys, listen to me. The story of Christmas, I want us to discover that the greatest birth the world has ever known, that God was doing so much to orchestrate and bring all of this to pass because the news of this birth would turn, listen to me, it would turn desperation into expectation. It would turn hopelessness into faith. It would turn sorrow into joy. And guess what? It still does today. Because God is faithful. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. And that's what I want us to understand when we study into this. So the title of the first message in this series, the title of today's message is called this. Listen, right on time. Right on time. Let me ask this question. Have you ever watched a movie or a TV show that there was all of a sudden, it's just chaos when you first tune in, and then all of a sudden it begins to backflash of how it got there that way? You know, I'm a Marvel fan, so I watch all these Marvel movies, and I remember when Deadpool came, it was like this craziness going on, and then it flashes back. Or if you had kids and you raised kids, if you ever watched The Emperor's New Groove, and Cusco is a llama, and he's all like depressed and bummed out, like, it wasn't always this way. I used to be a hip dude, and they backflash and tell this story. Or in TV shows. Like my wife and I years ago used to watch the show Lost, and it was such a mastery of backflashing. But my favorite TV series, This Is Us, when they did it, they were just so master of this idea of backflashing to tell to the current story. Well, when you look at the story of Christmas, because what they call it in movie making, is reverse chronology. And too often what happens when you look at the story of Christmas, we think about it, that all of a sudden Mary and Joseph now have to take this treacherous and dangerous journey, 9 months pregnant, to go down into Bethlehem. And then they get to Bethlehem and there's no hotel rooms available. There's no room in the inn. They end up in a stable to give birth in that condition and then lay Jesus, this baby promised, in a manger. A feeding trough for animals. And when all these shepherds show up and all, and we're like, man, this is really chaotic. Wow, it's like, and we come into the story, but we fail to realize that the story of Christmas began long, long before those events ever happened. Everything from the beginning of time was leading up to this moment. That God was getting the world ready for the birth of His Son. That God was at work orchestrating events, giving everything just the way He wanted it to be. Why? Because Revelation 13 tells us that God had already set a date on the calendar before there was ever a calendar to set one. And Jesus had a point that God determined would come. Listen to this. Galatians 4:4 says this. It says, But when the set time had fully come. See, God had a set time. When the set time had fully come, God sent his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those under the law, that we might receive adoption to sonship. Because we are his sons, God sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, the Spirit who calls out, Abba, Father. So we're no longer a slave, but God's child. And since you are his child, God has made you also an heir. Now that's a great story. That is great news to all. But you see, the world had been waiting for the Messiah for a very, very long time. In fact, the people who were waiting were tempted to believe that they felt like God was late. Have you ever felt that way? You were waiting for God to do something in your life, and you're like, man, is he on vacation? Is he sleeping? Oh my God, he's late. Where are you, God? Have you ever been there? Okay. Because when you're waiting can cause us to be anxious. Waiting can tempt us to think thoughts like, does God really care? Is my situation even important to him? Maybe he's got other events that are far more important and he's just forgotten about me. We can be tempted to think that way. But you and I must recognize that we're all waiting, and they were waiting. Because when you're waiting on God, we can feel like, where are you? See, humanity had been waiting. The story of Christmas actually began in the Garden of Eden. Humans have been entrusted with the care of God's creation. But yet we know the story. They failed. They sinned. They created a problem on this end. But God steps into that problem, listen, and makes a promise. This is where the story of Christmas begins. Genesis 3:15 said, and I will put enmity between you and the woman. God was speaking here to the serpent who had tempted the man and the woman. He said, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your seed and her seed. And he shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel. You see, the snake had lied about God. Let me ask you the question. Has the snake ever lied about God to you? Has he ever told you things like God doesn't really care about you? God doesn't really know what you need. God doesn't know how to take care of you. That God is more interested. No, God is a control freak. That God is angry. God is upset. God is, all of these things. The enemy tells us stories. He tells us lies about God. Has he ever told you lies? That maybe he doesn't love you. Maybe he doesn't really even like you. Has the enemy ever lied to you? You see, but God, this is so amazing. God stepped into the midst of it. So when you read the scriptures, you can overturn so many false ideas that they have about God. Because if God was really an angry ogre, he would have come in and dealt with the situation harshly. But when you read the story, what you discover in the midst of failure, God promises a solution. And there is a cryptic prophecy. That prophecy that the seed, he was talking to the devil. He was talking to the serpent that had deceived the man and the woman. And he promises this. He said, the seed of the woman. Well, wait a minute. Have you ever taken biology in high school? If you know anything about biology, for a baby to be born, it takes a contribution of a man and a woman, right? But biologically, the woman has a what? An egg. And they call the man having what? The seed, right? So here, God, in this cryptic prophecy, is foretelling a supernatural birth. He's telling of a virgin birth. He's telling of somebody that would come and that there would be an epic battle, that he would crush the head of the serpent. In other words, the control you think you now have, I'm sending the solution to bring freedom and deliverance. But yet, you will bruise his heel. He talks about a sacrificial, wounded healer. This was the beginning of the Christmas story. As the Jewish scriptures began to unfold, God, like that old children's fairy tale, began to leave breadcrumbs so that we would begin to see more and more and more of the way. The picture of this seed began to take shape because God calls Abraham, makes a covenant with him, and he tells him that through your seed, all of the nations of the world will be blessed. And the New Testament gives us the understanding he wasn't talking about seeds as many, but seed as one, which is Christ. And then Abraham's grandson Jacob has 12 children. And now God, through the prophets, begins to tell us that the seed will come through Judah. A king will arise from him. And then we know that he's the son of David. And all of a sudden the scriptures begin to bring this picture to pass. That he would be a warrior, that he would be a priest, that he would be one that would bring freedom and liberation and peace. That peace, he would bring peace on earth. That all of these things, he would be a suffering servant. All of these began to build the picture of the Messiah. That's what this figure, this seed, became known of as in the Hebrew Bible. But the prophet Daniel, Daniel had been taken captive by the Babylonians, and while in captivity there, God used Daniel in multiple ways in the Babylonian government, but Daniel was also a prophet. Daniel had recognized that the time that Jeremiah had prophesied of 70 years of captivity was up, and began to pray. And when he began to pray, God revealed to him what was going to happen. And he shows him a vision that there would be 4 empires that would arise before Messiah came. Those were shown to him as beasts, but we see the revelation that the first was revealed as Babylon, the Babylonian Empire. And so in essence, through this time, Daniel gives this word. Daniel 7 in verse 13 says this: I was watching in the night visions, and behold, one like the Son of Man, coming with the clouds of heaven. He came to the Ancient of Days, and they brought him near before him. And then to him was given dominion and glory and a kingdom, that all peoples, nations, and languages shall serve him. His dominion is an everlasting dominion, which shall not pass away, and his kingdom, the one which shall not be destroyed. This was one of the chief scriptures of hope to the Israeli people. This was the understanding that the promised Messiah, this was the revelation that he would bring a kingdom to which there would be no end. This was actually because Daniel, we'll cover this later in this series, but listen, Daniel, when he was in Babylon, was placed with the wise men of Babylon. Later we're going to discover those were the Magi. Those were the ones. And this prophecy of Daniel is what caused the Magi to take the trip from the east to come to Jerusalem in search of the king that they had saw his star proclaiming his birth. You see, this was one. What's fascinating is this. What Daniel calls this figure he identifies as the Son of Man was in truth the Messiah. And when you read the Gospels, this was Jesus' favorite title. He always referred to himself as the Son of Man. Do you ever wonder why? When he was put on trial by the Sanhedrin, and he said to them, and you will see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of glory. He was referring directly to this prophecy, which is why the high priest tore his clothes and said, we need no more testimony. He has blasphemed. Why? Because the Messiah was more than just a man. But this was a mystery. In fact, do you understand why Jesus asked the chief priests and leaders of the nation, the scribes and the Pharisees, who is the Messiah? They said, he's the son of David. He said, well, why did David then call him his Lord? He quotes to them Psalm 110, which is another messianic prophecy. And David said, and the Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. He said, if he was his son, why did he call him his Lord? And they all scratched their head and couldn't answer the question, why? Because the Messiah, although he was a man, was more than a man. This was the one that had been promised. This was the one that said that God had promised to bring solutions to what had gone on the earth. But you see, people had been waiting for a very, very long time for the promise of the Messiah to be fulfilled. In fact, the hardest time for the Jewish people in their time of waiting was with the 400 years that preceded the birth of Jesus. Why was that time difficult? Because it was in that period of time that God no longer spoke. There was no prophecy. There was no prophets. There was no longer anything. It was the time, it's called the intertestament time. In other words, it's between the Old Testament and the New Testament. It was a time frame from Malachi to Matthew. 400 years of silence. That's a long time to be waiting. During that period, the Jewish people were probably thinking, had we gone too far? Was God mad? Was God angry? What was he up to? Nothing. Silent. It was like this. I don't know if you've ever read. C.S. Lewis was a great Christian thinker and author. And C.S. Lewis wrote what were called the Chronicles of Narnia. And probably the most famous book in that series was The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. Disney made a movie about it years ago, if you've never seen it. But it's a fascinating allegorical story. But during this particular story, these 4 children go into a wardrobe and they come to a land called Narnia. And what they discover when they go into this place is that the white witch who had ruled over Narnia had cast a spell over Narnia. And this is the way the book says it. It was always winter and never Christmas. I gotta feel like the people of Israel during that 400-year period probably felt like what he said in that book, that it was always winter and never Christmas. When will this ever take place? When will this ever come about? Was this all a fantasy? Was this all a fairy tale? Will God, has he abandoned that? Is he second thought? Is it not true? Will he not perform it? You see, one of the most vulnerable, one of the most difficult points is when you're in a waiting room. Have you ever been in a waiting room, like in a hospital, where a loved one or someone was undergoing surgery? You know in those moments you're powerless. You know in those moments you can feel alone, that you can feel vulnerable. It's difficult in a waiting room. Or if you've had medical tests and you go to the doctor's office, and 9 out of 10 times if you go to the doctor's office, what are you going to do? Wait, even if you show up on time. Okay? I'm just being real with you, okay? Right? I mean, anybody ever experienced that? Okay? But when you're waiting for results, minutes can feel like hours, okay? They can feel like months, depending on the news you're waiting to hear. And so many of us, okay, have you ever been in God's waiting room? In that situation where you're waiting for God to move? When you're waiting on God and you're saying, because why? In this room, there is a lot of people that you've been in the waiting room. You've been in God's waiting room. Maybe you're married and you've been waiting on a child and you feel like it's always been winter. And when will it ever be Christmas? Some of you that are single in this room and you've been waiting on a spouse, and man, that winter seems really, really long. Will Christmas ever come? And some of you, okay, you've been sick and you've been waiting on a healing. Some of you, you've been underemployed or unemployed. And you've been waiting on a job. You've been waiting on an opportunity. And it seems like it's been a very, very long time. God, when will it gonna be? When will you move? When will you do something? Some of you, you've been waiting for a spouse to come to Christ. And it's been a long, long winter. Some of you, you're waiting for a prodigal child to come home. Some of you, your friend, family member, loved one, you want to see come off of an addiction. And you've been waiting. You've been in God's waiting room. And you feel vulnerable. You feel powerless. You're wondering, God, where are you? God, when will you move? When will you do something? When will you answer? When will you speak? When will you change my situation? When will this ever happen? God, are you mad at me? Are you on vacation? Are you sleeping? Where are you? You ever been there? In God's waiting room? You see, the people of Israel, they had been waiting. The people of the world had been waiting for a very long time. But God had been preparing for this moment we all call Christmas. God was getting ready all of the details, everything just the way He wanted it and needed it to be. For those that have been waiting between Malachi and Matthew, what I want you to understand today, what I want you to know is that you can trust God's timing. This often gets overlooked, but listen to this. When we talk about the Christmas story, in Luke 2 and verse 1, it says, "In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree." Just a side note for you. Do you know that in the 21st century, the overwhelming majority of people would not know who Caesar Augustus was if he wasn't a footnote in the story of Jesus? Unless you were a history buff. Okay? Why do common people know that, Ann? Because he's a part of this story. In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world. And this was the first census that took place while Quintarius was the governor of Syria. And everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, the town of David, because he belonged to the house and line of David. See, God was moving all things. God is large and in charge. That's what you need to understand. He was moving emperors. He was moving people. He was moving all the parts and putting everything in place because God had a set time. And now was that time. The 400 years. See, the 400 years of silence, the people of Israel, they believe, God, where are you? What are you doing? But during those 400 years, let me help you see what God was up to. Because what people didn't understand, God was busy working that whole time. Because why? When the people of Israel came out of captivity, they rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem. But then Malachi, the last prophet, spoke, and there was nothing. But during that second temple period was when actually the Jewish Bible, the Jewish scriptures came together, what they call the Tanakh. That was when it was assembled. That was when it was put together. But something else occurred during that time. Because Daniel had foretold that there would be 4 empires that came. And now the Persian Empire that had displaced the Babylonian Empire, they began a conquest and they wanted to take over Greece. But King Macedon united all of the Greek city-states to war against the Persians and defeated the Persian Empire. And his son, Alexander, became known as Alexander the Great because now he conquered all the way from Europe to China. And for the first time in human history, all of the world was united in a common language. All of the world then spoke Greek. And also, the Greeks had introduced the way they thought, Socratic form of learning. Asking questions became the common area. And so now, with all of these events, and because the Jewish scriptures had now been assembled, they were translated into the Greek language, known as the Septuagint. Now all the world could read what God had promised, because what the Jewish people had misunderstood and missed was that they were to be a light to the Gentile world, that the Messiah was not just the King of Israel, but he was coming as the King of the whole world, that through Israel God would do this, but it wasn't just for Israel. This was a message for the whole world, and now the world had the scriptures. Now the world began to ask questions as they began to read the Hebrew scriptures. Is the Messiah coming? Will this happen in our time? All of this began to go. Now, the last empire, Rome, comes into being. They take out the Greeks. Now, the Rome basically controls the world. And in 63 BC, something significant happens. Rome takes control of Israel. And why is that significant? Because one thing they did was they displaced the Jews all over the Roman Empire, which was what gave the ability for the gospel to spread. Because the early part of the Christian movement was founded and rooted in the Jewish hope for the world. The Jewish scriptures were the backstory of all that God had promised through the Messiah. And now, it wouldn't just remain in Israel. It was set up, but also the Romans were brutal. They were brutal to the Jews as much as the Egyptians were, and worse. And what did it happen when the Egyptians had oppressed the Jews in Egypt? They cried out to God and their oppression, and now under Roman control, the Jews began to cry out, began to believe for the Messiah at a greater level than they had ever had before. And all of this was building up. All of this was orchestrating. But the Romans, during their control, created roads throughout all of the world at that time. Transportation became, because something happened under Caesar Augustus, for the first time in the history of the world, there was peace. They called it Pax Roma. For 2 centuries, there was peace. So you could travel the roads. There was patrols and guards. There was safety. People felt, now there was commerce and trade and people traveling all over the empire. All of this was set because why? God wanted Jesus to come not just for the Jewish people, but for the world. And now, everything is set. God was busy during that time working all of these details out that nobody understood at the time that it was going on. Nobody recognized that God had been busy setting everything up just the way he wanted. It was like this master chess game. God had moved all of the positions in place to checkmate the devil and set up the world for the greatest news that we would ever know and understand. And so God, when he had it all set, this is what I want you to know, because maybe, by now you thought your life would be different. Maybe by now you thought you'd be married. Maybe by now you thought you'd have a family. Maybe by now you thought your career would have taken off. Maybe by now you thought that situations in your life would be far radically different than the situations you find yourself in. And you're tempted to think, you're tempted to believe, where is God? Do I matter? Am I important to God? And here's what I want you to know. The Christmas story is a reminder and a teacher for us. Because listen, 3 simple things I want us to take out of this today. Number 1, the Christmas story reminds us that we can always trust God's timing. See, God is rarely ever early, but he is actually never ever late. That's what you need to wonder. We want it to happen sooner. I mean, come on. We all know we want patience. The worst part about patience is when you have to wait for something, right? And it's hard in those times. But God says, whoa, you can trust me. I got it under control. You see, God is waiting us. When we're waiting on God, he lets us know we can trust him. He knows what's best. He hasn't forgotten about us. He cared about us. He loves us. Why? Because the story of Christmas is the testament of how much God loved us. And that's what you can come to understand, because Romans 8:32 says it this way. He who did not spare his own son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? Jesus is the proof positive that we matter to God. And even when you don't know or understand when or how or why what's going on is going on, you can trust God's timing. God knows what's best. It's the realization that he's God, we're not. And we can trust him. We can trust him. Why? Because that's what the Christmas story tells us. But secondly, the Christmas story teaches us that while we're waiting on God, God is working. See, right now, you're tempted to believe, man, is God on vacation? I don't get it. Why? Why? God, why am I waiting so long? Why is this taking so long? But God is absolutely at work. You can't see it, But I can tell you the truth. He's at work in your life in ways that you don't even understand. He's not forgotten you. He's large and in charge. He's controlling this universe and to put it into everything that he intended and purposed for it to do to bring about his glory. You don't know what best ways will work in your life, but God's saying you can trust me. Know that I'm working on your behalf. Why? Because he works all things together for good, for those who love him, who are called according to his purpose. God hasn't forgotten you. God knows. He's working on your behalf. You don't see it. You can't see it. But guess what? Faith is not what you see. Faith is a confidence in your heart that you know that God is who he said he is, that he will do everything that he promised he will do. You see, faith is like a muscle. The more you exercise it, the stronger it gets. So listen to this promise from God. And the prophet Isaiah said it this way. But those, Isaiah 40:31 says, but those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They will run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. It doesn't produce weakness. It produces strength. God says, when you trust me, when you put your trust in me, know this, I neither slumber nor sleep, which is why you can lay down and sleep tight tonight. I got it under control. I'm for you. I'm with you. And if I be for you, who can be against you? Trust me. You may not see it. You may not understand it, but I'm working in your life in ways that you can't figure out. And when it's all brought to its fulfillment, you will stand astounded, because that's what glorifies God. If you can do it in your own strength, if you can come up with it in your own way, then how would God be glorified through those ends? See, the nation of Israel had all their own ideas, but God knew exactly what he was doing. And the good news to us is God orchestrated it all and brought it all to pass. And Jesus is proof that God has never stopped working to bring his will to pass. And more importantly, in our lives, individually and personally. If you've been in the waiting room, you can trust God is working on your behalf. Just like that doctor that's in that operating room, you're powerless to do what he's doing for your loved one. But guess what? He was trained and knows what he's doing. But I'm going to tell you, the best doctor that was ever born, Jesus is the physician, Jehovah Rapha. He's the one that's orchestrating all and doing everything that's needed to bring to pass his will in your life. But listen to me. Listen to me. Lastly, the Christmas story ensures us that God always keeps his promises. See, that's the good news you need to understand. You want it yesterday. God knows when, he knows how, but you can trust and be assured he always keeps his promises. God made so many promises regarding the birth of his son. He told us not only where he would be born, he told us how he would be born. He told us that they would have to escape and go to Egypt. He told so many things. In fact, when you look at the life of Jesus, Jesus fulfilled over 330 messianic promises to precision. Why? Because God knows how to fulfill his promises. God knows what he's doing. God is for you. God is with you. God knows he's trustworthy. He is who he said he is. He will do what he promised he will do. That's why the Bible tells us that this is the victory that overcomes the world, even our faith. You and I need to recognize that we can trust that God is working on our behalf, my friends. Why did God wait so long to bring the first Christmas? Why is he waiting at times? See, sometimes we're tempted to believe because Jesus made a promise. He made a promise that I will return. And there's a lot of Christians been talking about it for a long time. And even 2 Peter tells us that people in the world, and it is, you hear this today, skeptics will say all the time, the promise has been said this. Y'all been blabbing that for 2,000 years and it hasn't come to pass. Y'all drank the Kool-Aid, okay? Right? But here's the point. God is never slack concerning his promises. Why is God waiting? He's not wanting any to perish, but that all to come to repentance. God knows the appropriate time. You can trust in his time. Why was God waiting? Because God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son. But I need you to take that more personally right now. God so loved you that he sent his one and only son. That's the assurance in your heart, that you can always trust his timing, that you can always know he's working, and you can be assured he will always keep his promises.